Hello, everyone. This is an ongoing series that we have here online live on Facebook. And this presentation will also be recorded and made available on YouTube Live. The Manitoba Museum and the homes that we are broadcasting from today are on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Aniniwak, and the traditional territories of the Dakota and the homeland of the Métis. And while we won't be addressing it in our talk today, we do certainly feel it's very important to recognize that the First Nations of this area and beyond were greatly impacted by introduced diseases, often with devastating consequences. We also would like to acknowledge that the water we drink here in Winnipeg comes to us from Treaty 3 lands, and that the right to clean water, the right to have it accessible to all, is very important. So what we're going to be talking about today is we're going to be focusing on the early 20th century and waves of epidemic disease here in Manitoba. And it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Leah Morton. So Leah, if you want to join me here. Hi, Leah. Oh, and Leah, if you just want to turn your mic on and just stop sharing your screen there, that would be great. Awesome. There we are. So welcome. So Dr. Leah Morton is one of the team who was instrumental in putting together our new Winnipeg Gallery. Many of you out there may not have had a chance to see it. We hope that you will very soon in the near future have an opportunity to come see the Winnipeg Gallery. Before the museum closed, one of the last things that I did was show some grade 11s, the Winnipeg Gallery, and my favorite thing in it is our interactive timeline map. Usually my go-to thing is to show them the grasshoppers infestations of the late 1800s. But on that day, they were particularly interested in the history of pandemics that's on the timeline map. And this, of course, is from your work, Leah.
Yep. The disasters were my idea, just so when you see the map, you think of me.
Yeah, I think of you every time I see those grasshoppers fly across the screen. Yeah, so we're so pleased to have Leah as part of our team, as this is part of her background specialty. And so Leah will start a presentation shortly. We will also be having a question and answer session. So if you are on Zoom webinar, you can type your questions into the chat at any time and we'll come to them later. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you can put your questions in the comments and those will be relayed to us for the question and answer session. I also want to introduce the other thing, I guess, that I have with me today. This is my typhoid stuffy. Usually I use this to introduce children to the issues of typhoid in early Winnipeg history. Typhoid is a bacteria, and there still are outbreaks of typhoid in the world today, and we would treat them with antibiotics. Of course, in the past, people of Winnipeg did not have access to those antibiotics to deal with the microscopic versions of these. So in our talk today, just want to underline that we're not medical professionals and that please don't be asking us medical questions, but historical questions are very welcome. So I've got typhoid here. Who have you got, Leah?
I have the polio virus. I actually have two of them, but only one of them is going to make an appearance today.
You play playing favorites.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to excuse myself and I'll be just in the background in the chat. And if you want to take it away, Leah.
Sure. I just need to get my PowerPoint set up. I have some kind of neat pictures for you guys.
And what I did forget to ask is, since there is so much of a new vocabulary today, did you want to just define some terms before we start?
Yeah, for sure. So throughout this talk, you might hear me use the terms outbreak, epidemic, and pandemic. So an outbreak is just kind of, when doctors start seeing a small increase in a number of cases of an illness or a disease. Sometimes that can just peter out, but sometimes you'll see the number of cases will increase. And so when you have a large number of cases of a particular illness or a disease in an area, that's often referred to as an epidemic. So you could have, for example, an epidemic of typhoid, which I'm going to talk about in Winnipeg, or you could have a polio epidemic in Manitoba. When there is a high number of cases in several countries around the world, that's referred to as a pandemic. So right now we're experiencing the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919. I guess the other thing, again, as Anya said, I'm not a scientist or a medical professional, but I do want to say that two of the diseases I'm going to be talking about today are caused by viruses, and one, which is typhoid fever, is bacterial. Both can make you sick, but there's differences between the two, and I'm not really going to get into them at all. It's not necessarily important for what we are going to talk about today. So again, my name is Leah Morton. I work at the Manitoba Museum. When it's open, I'm at home right now. I'm a historian, and polio is my specialty, so that was what my dissertation was on. And since we're hearing about COVID-19 all the time in the news, and probably talking with your friends and family all the time, I thought I would talk about some other diseases that Winnipeggers have faced in the past. And I think you'll see by the end of the talk that we're pretty used to fighting back against diseases. I don't have time to talk about every disease that Winnipeggers have dealt with, so I picked three from the early 1900s: typhoid fever, influenza, and polio. And as Anya said, I am happy to answer some questions after this talk. So the first disease I'm going to talk about is typhoid fever. So Winnipeg started as a small town, but the arrival of the railway in the 1880s made its population explode. So all of a sudden you have people kind of pouring into Winnipeg. And along with more people came some pretty serious water issues and health issues. In the 1880s, Winnipeggers used the Red and Assiniboine rivers as sources of drinking water. Unfortunately, they also dumped raw sewage in the rivers, and this often led to something called typhoid fever. So here's my non-scientific rendition of waste being dumped into the rivers. So typhoid fever is caused by a bacteria, and despite the little typhoid stuffy looking cute, and I have a picture of one here, typhoid fever had the potential to be pretty dangerous. It spread through contaminated food, contaminated water, or through close contact with someone who is already infected with typhoid. Some of the symptoms of typhoid fever include fever, obviously, hence the name, headaches, severe abdominal pain or a swollen stomach, diarrhea, rashes on your body, muscle aches, and a very dry cough. And of course, it could also lead to death in some cases. Because early Winnipeggers used the rivers as both a toilet and, let's say, a water fountain, there were cases of typhoid fever every summer and every fall. So it was kind of always present in Winnipeg, and people were pretty used to it. And in fact, locals called typhoid fever Red River fever. So they kind of knew that it was around. What did public health officials do about typhoid fever in Winnipeg? Well, until about 1905, they didn't do very much about it. And that's because typhoid mostly occurred in the North End amongst non-English speaking newcomers. And these people were often blamed for the outbreaks, even though, their low wages and poor housing conditions, including no indoor plumbing, which the city was not interested in upgrading, these conditions made it very difficult for North End residents to stay healthy. But by the early 1900s, most middle and upper class Winnipeggers had indoor plumbing, and the city had dug a number of wells for them to use instead of river water, so they weren't super concerned about typhoid. But then something happened to make public health officials in Winnipeg actually do something about Winnipeg's bad water situation and high typhoid fever rates. What was it? So this is Ashdown's hardware store. It was located on Main Street in Winnipeg. And in October 1904, it caught on fire. Here you have my extremely accurate historical rendition of Ashdown's hardware store on fire. So it caught fire in October 1904. but firefighters didn't have enough water to put it out. And so what they did was include river water in the pipes, right? So they pumped river water into the pipes to help put out the fire. Here's the aftermath of the Ashdown hardware store fire. So that was in October. Another fire in December of that year, 1904, meant that river water once again was mixed in with the city supply. So it was used to put out the fire, but it also was used in people's homes. That river water was contaminated, and that led to a really big typhoid epidemic. In 1904, there were over 1,200 cases of typhoid in Winnipeg, and close to 2,000 cases in 1905, and the death rates in Winnipeg were some of the highest in North America. So, you know, comparable to big American cities like New York and Boston. The important thing here is that this 1904-1905 typhoid fever epidemic didn't just hit the north end. It also affected the upper and middle class neighborhoods of Winnipeg, and that is what forced the city to act. So finally they thought, oh, we need to do something about typhoid fever. So what did Winnipeg do? The first thing they did was build the James Avenue pumping station. And they built that to protect the business district. So that's basically what we know as the exchange district now. So the James Avenue pumping station provided river water only to fight fires. So it was kept totally separate from the city's domestic water supply. The second thing the city did was decide to get rid of outhouses, community outhouses, which were known as box closets. And you can see one of them on the screen there. There were over 12,000 box closets in the city. So they were just kind of, I don't know, peppered throughout the city. Kids played by them, you know, they were by houses at the end of streets and so on. And obviously none of them had hand washing facilities, right? If you can look at the box closet there, it's probably obvious that there weren't any sinks and soap in them. And since typhoid is present in bodily waste, the germs from these box closets could be brought into homes and lead to further infection. So the city kind of started this campaign to get rid of box closets. And by 1909, public health officials in Winnipeg had actually gotten rid of all of them. So in 1909, the last one was torn down. The final thing the city did, and you can learn more about this in the Winnipeg Gallery when the museum reopens, is they built the aqueduct, which brought a clean water supply to Winnipeg from Shoal Lake in Ontario. The aqueduct helped Winnipeggers to stay healthy. It provided them with a very clean water supply, but it was very detrimental to the First Nations peoples who lived in and around Shoal Lake. The next disease I want to talk to you about is influenza. So I'm going to talk about the influenza pandemic of 1918-1919. So in those years, a very deadly influenza pandemic spread around the world. It's estimated that over 55,000 Canadians died during this pandemic, and Winnipeg, of course, was not spared. More than 13,000 cases were officially reported in Winnipeg, and over 1,200 people died. And most of the deaths were basically otherwise healthy men between the ages of 20 and 39. So that's not the usual demographic that is hit the hardest by influenza. And it's important to note that when I say Winnipeg, in this context, it doesn't include places like St. Boniface, Fort Garry, or St. James, or any other places, any other parts of the city that didn't actually become part of Winnipeg until the 1970s. So the actual number of cases for what we would now consider Metro Winnipeg would have been a lot higher. So influenza is a very contagious viral disease. Early symptoms like headaches, fevers, sore throat, chills were often very mild, but for some people the symptoms got worse. So you had things like nausea, very severe headaches, vomiting, extremely high fevers. People got secondary infections of bronchitis and pneumonia. They coughed up blood. And it's been reported that people's skin often turned a blue or even lilac color just before they passed away. The influenza pandemic hit Winnipeg in 2 waves. The first wave from October to December 1918 was the most severe. And the second wave, which lasted from about February to April 1919, was less so. So at the end of September 1918, about 20 returning soldiers, right? So this is at the end of the First World War. Around 20 returning soldiers who were suspected of having the flu arrived in Winnipeg. And so they were immediately sent to a private hospital in the south end of the city. And you can see a picture of that on the screen, the IODE Convalescent Soldiers Home. After their arrival, the number of flu cases began to grow in the city, right? So all of a sudden cases are being reported. And by the end of October, hundreds of cases were being reported on a daily basis. As the number of cases grew and grew in the city, patients were sent first to the King George Isolation Hospital. That's part of the Winnipeg Municipal Hospitals complex. There were 3 hospitals that made up the municipals, and they were located where Riverview Health Center is now. But because there were so many cases in the city, the King George was quickly overwhelmed with patients, and so most people therefore kind of had to suffer through influenza in their own homes. So how do Winnipeg's public health officials react to the influenza outbreak? Well, they did a few things to try and help contain the disease. One thing that officials tried were vaccines. One doctor used a vaccine developed in the United States. So he brought kind of vials of this vaccine up to Winnipeg and tried it on anyone who thought they might want to try the vaccine. And then Dr. Fred Cadam, who was a military doctor at the time, he developed his own vaccine. And in 1918, you didn't have all these kind of ethics, rules, and regulations that you have right now. So anyone, I guess preferably a doctor, could come up with a vaccine. And if they could convince people to try it, then, you know, go nuts, right? So you have doctors in Winnipeg like Fred Cadam developing their own vaccines. These vaccines were very popular amongst Winnipeggers, so people lined up to get them. They were afraid of getting the flu, but they weren't effective. So Cadam was a military doctor, and he was actually a very good hockey player. He played for the Winnipeg Victorias during the influenza pandemic, and then later he was put in charge of the provincial laboratory. So he was in charge of the provincial lab from 1923 to 1947, and when he retired, it was named after him. So if the name Cadam sounds familiar to you, that's because it's been in the news a lot recently, since all COVID-19 tests are processed at the Cadam lab. So that's where that name is from. Public health officials tried a few other things to kind of mitigate the effects of the disease. One thing they did was try to educate citizens by distributing pamphlets and information on topics like proper hygiene and health habits. And these were written in multiple languages, so they reached all Winnipeggers. And on the screen, there's an example of one of these pamphlets about the flu that's written in English. Public health officials also tried to persuade citizens to follow public health directives. For example, they asked them to please report all cases. They asked people who were sick to voluntarily stay at home, right? Now we hear that today, please self-isolate, so something similar. Officials also suggested that people wear masks, but they didn't make masks mandatory or compulsory. So on the screen, you can see a picture of newspaper delivery boys. I guess they work for the Free Press, and they're all wearing masks. What had the biggest impact on Winnipeggers, though, and I think this is going to sound familiar to a lot of you, was the closure of public places. So in October of 1918, officials used the Public Health Act to close a lot of public places, and those closures lasted for 6 weeks. Some of the places that were closed included schools, universities, movie theaters, churches, dance halls, billiard halls, basically any place where a large number of people might gather. A lot of workplaces stayed open though, and people continued to work. And those people who continued to work, such as nurses, police, firemen, telephone operators, and especially factory workers, they were really hit hard by the flu. even though a lot of workplaces stayed open, many people couldn't work, either because they got sick or their family members got sick. So there's lots of evidence of influenza kind of tearing through whole families. So everybody was sick at the same time. So a lot of people weren't able to work. And when they didn't work, they didn't get paid. So today there are policies in place to help Canadians who can't work due to COVID-19, but this wasn't the case during the influenza pandemic. And so instead you have examples and evidence of Winnipeggers helping each other. So there were a number of charities in the city. Charities helped. Ethnic and work-related organizations provided assistance in the form of food, money, healthcare if they could. Unions helped with funeral expenses. And many middle-class women helped take care of those who were sick. Labor leaders asked the city for compensation for lost wages, right, for people who couldn't work because they were sick. But the city refused to help. The city basically said that, you know, everyone's been inconvenienced by this influenza pandemic, so we're not going to make up for lost wages. We know now, though, that not everyone experienced the influenza pandemic in the same way, right? Those in the North End suffered the most. But still, like I said, you do have evidence of Winnipeggers kind of coming together and trying to help each other out the best that they could. So the final disease I want to talk about is poliomyelitis. It's a long name and most people simply refer to it as polio, so that's what I'm going to do, and that's the little polio guy that I have here. Polio caused a lot of problems for Winnipeggers and for Manitobans because there were 6 really big polio epidemics between 1928 and 1953 in this province. The 1953 polio epidemic, which was mainly centered in Winnipeg, ended up being the worst in Canadian history. So the polio virus can enter the body's digestive system, and it's usually kind of neutralized or killed there. If not, people experienced early symptoms such as headaches, upset stomach, maybe sore muscles. A lot of people just remembered feeling just maybe like they were getting a cold, even though it was the middle of summer, so they just generally felt unwell. If the virus isn't initially killed by the body's defenses, the polio virus can attack the central nervous system, and then people would have more severe symptoms. This could sometimes result in paralysis. So usually it would be your limbs, maybe your shoulder muscles or stomach muscles that would become paralyzed. Sometimes temporary, sometimes permanently. The virus can also attack parts of the central nervous system that controls swallowing and breathing, and that is referred to as bulbar polio. Polio really scared people. In the 1920s and 1930s, it was mostly young children, so kids under the age of 10 who got polio. And it also caused disabilities at a time when, you know, accessibility issues weren't even really a concern. They weren't even really an afterthought. And into the 1950s, more and more adults started getting polio during the epidemics, and more cases of bulbar polio were being reported. And that meant that people had to be placed into respirators, which are more commonly known as iron lungs. So if you've heard the term iron lung, it's a respirator that was used for specific types of people with polio. And this respirator that I have on the screen is part of the Manitoba Museum's collection. It's not on display, it's in storage, but the museum does have one. So iron lungs expand the chest and force air through the nose and mouth into a person's lungs. Unlike the ventilators that are used for very serious COVID-19 cases, iron lungs did not damage a person's lungs. So they could be used for very long periods of time, indefinitely if necessary. Sometimes people only needed them, you know, for a week, 2 weeks. Sometimes people spent the rest of their lives using respirators. So for decades, doctors and public health officials tried to do something to contain polio and to effectively help patients, treat patients. Dr. Kadam, who we met during the influenza epidemic, was also involved in trying to help with the polio epidemics, especially in 1928. In that year, he experimented with injecting the blood of recovered polio patients into other people. Again, that wasn't very effective. In the 1930s, it was generally believed that polio entered through the nose. So a lot of scientists and doctors kind of scrambled to come up with nasal sprays to try to prevent polio. Nasal sprays didn't work. Some of them were harmful. Some of them had lead in them. Luckily, the one used in Manitoba wasn't harmful, but it also didn't work. And it unfortunately turned people's noses bright yellow. So, in the 1930s, when the polio epidemic was about, if you saw people walking around with bright yellow noses, you knew they had tried the nasal spray. So for many years, the treatment for patients with limb weakness or paralysis was splinting and immobilizing. So putting splints on the affected body parts and making people stay in bed for long periods of time, sometimes for over a year. And even if a person only had weakness or paralysis, let's say in one arm or one leg, this was the accepted treatment, and doctors didn't like to deviate from the accepted treatments. In the 1940s, though, an Australian woman named Elizabeth Kenny came up with a new treatment, and it involved putting really hot cloths or hot packs onto people's limbs. So if your leg was affected, they put a hot pack on your leg, and then stretching them and moving them. So Kenny's treatment was basically the opposite of what was seen as standard, and she faced a lot of ridicule from the medical establishment. For medical professionals. Kenny traveled to the United States to try and get doctors there to listen to her. Some did, but in general, it didn't seem like people were too interested in what she had to say. That is, until a doctor in Winnipeg named Bruce Chown, who you can see on the screen, decided to kind of listen to what Kenny had to say. And I guess I should mention, in the picture of Elizabeth Kenny demonstrating the Kenny method, that's her with the white hair holding the child's foot. So Bruce Chown was a pediatrician at Children's Hospital, and he was really frustrated by his inability to help young polio patients. And so in 1941, he went to the United States to meet with Kenny, and then he invited her to Winnipeg, right in the middle of the 1941 epidemic. So he basically said, yeah, I like what you have to say. This is interesting. We're in the middle of an epidemic right now. Why don't you come on up to Winnipeg and show us what you could do with patients? So after people's fevers subsided and patients were thought to be out of the danger zone, Kenny and the nurses she treated were allowed to start heating up people's limbs with the hot cloths and moving them around, maneuvering the limbs. And this is referred to as the Kenny method. And so it was really taken quite seriously in Winnipeg by Chown and others. And it became the new standard treatment for polio patients who were suffering from paralysis. So the Kenny method and respirators or iron lungs really revolutionized the treatment of polio. But with these new innovations and changes came other problems. And the biggest fear about respirators was what would happen if the power went out. If there was no power in a hospital, the people inside the iron lungs could suffocate unless the machines were operated manually, right? Unless they were operated by hand. So most nurses who worked on polio wards, including the nurses who worked on the polio wards at the King George Isolation Hospital, were trained to do that. So as part of the training, they were taught, here's what you do if there's no power, here's how you work an iron lung. But it was quite difficult. It was actually very involved, and there were different types of respirators, made by different manufacturers. But in general, it took about 3 people to keep one respirator going by hand. So in 1953, in the middle of the worst polio epidemic in Canadian history, there were 92 iron lungs in operation at the same time on the polio wards of the King George Isolation Hospital. 92. Do you think the power went out? Well, it's Winnipeg, of course it did. So you have almost 100 iron lungs in use, and the power went out one night for 4 hours. So as soon as people, other employees in the other municipal hospitals heard that the power went out on the polio wards, they all ran over to the King George, right? They converged on it and said, what can we do to help? So you have nurses, doctors, janitors, everyone who could be spared went into the polio wards to help keep these iron lungs going. But besides employees, you also had random people from the surrounding neighborhood. Once they saw that the power was out at the King George, they ran into the hospital to help, right? They said, what can we do to help? So even if it just meant holding a flashlight so medical professionals could see what they were doing, neighbors, citizens, Winnipeggers, they just wanted to help. And so together, they succeeded in keeping all 92 patients alive for the 4 hours it took to get the power restored. And you can see in this picture I have on the screen, just 2 iron lungs from the King George Hospital. Those rooms are cramped. The polio wards are very cramped, right? They have the iron lungs, but they also have other tables with other equipment on them. So it's really hard to imagine probably the scene in the polio wards that night with hundreds of people trying to keep 92 patients alive for 4 hours. But just like in the influenza epidemic, this is an example of Winnipeggers really coming together to provide assistance to each other during a medical emergency, during a time of uncertainty. So I could talk a lot more about each of these diseases, and I could probably talk about some other epidemics or outbreaks that happened here, but I won't. I mainly wanted to give you a broad overview of 3 outbreaks that happened in Winnipeg, and to show some of the ways that public health officials and everyday Winnipeggers tried to help control these diseases, or at least make them easier to get through. So that's it for my talk, and I will now, I think, stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to answer or try to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was very interesting. I was particularly keen to hear about polio because I think most people don't know very much about the polio epidemics here in Manitoba. Though I was talking to a friend last night who said, oh yeah, I didn't know about that. And they said, wait a minute, no, my uncle had polio. Myself and my family, my grandfather had polio. So we have a few questions. People are please welcome to put questions in the Facebook comments and they will be relayed to us. They will also be, those of you on Zoom, put them in the chat. So one question, just wondering, if the building that housed the convalescent soldiers home is still in existence,
Sorry, if it's still in existence?
Is that building?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. It's very possible. Winnipeg has a lot of kind of historic buildings and homes that have been repurposed. I know the Ashdown hardware store still exists. It's not a hardware store anymore, but yeah, I think if you just look up IODE convalescent home, the Manitoba Historical Society website has a lot of information on historical buildings, so they would probably have more information on that building for sure.
Yeah, and actually, Alex, do you want to just tell us all, unmute yourself, and I think she has the answer.
Yeah, so I don't believe the IODE convalescent home is around anymore. Sorry to butt in here. But there are a couple of other convalescent homes that still are. So one convalescent home is now the Asper Jewish Community Campus, and another is Deer Lodge. So those both, the original buildings are still there.
Yeah, and my grandfather actually had polio, I believe in 1952, and there was an outbreak in Rivers at the Air Force Base where he was stationed, and he spent a lot of time at Deer Lodge. So, the convalescent home and the King George, these weren't the only places that where people were treated. They're just kind of the ones that came up today.
Thank you, Alex. That's great. So we have a question here from Zoom. Hyatt says, you explained that Winnipeg and Manitoba were no exceptions to the implications of past pandemics. Can you speculate why COVID-19 has not taken hold here as it has around the world, as well as in past epidemics? So what trends do you see in Winnipeg's place in this history of pandemics?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard to know. I think in hindsight, we'll be able to maybe make better educated guesses or hypotheses about that. Personally, I think it has to do with a couple things. I think we were lucky in that Manitoba's spring break was very late. It was supposed to be at the end of March, first week of April. And so by then everything was already closed. Travel was already restricted. And so as opposed to, say, provinces like Quebec, where their spring break was even earlier. And so people had gone, to warmer climates and came back and perhaps brought the virus with them. Winnipeggers and Manitobans were already shut down by the time we were supposed to have our spring break. So I think that probably had something to do with it. And I'll also give a shout out to Winnipeggers and Manitobans. From what I've seen, everyone's been really great about following public health directives. Public health officials have been pretty transparent with what's going on. People have been social distancing, isolating at home, where I see a lot of people wearing masks. So I think it's probably a combination of many different factors, for sure.
Another question. What should we have learned from past epidemics that could help us prepare for COVID-19?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that specifically. If I did, I'd probably be a millionaire because I would sell my answer to people. But I think the striking thing is that there's so many similarities between other epidemics and this one, maybe not in the the scientific aspect, but in the way that we approach them. So things that were happening 100 years ago, we're still doing them, and some of them worked, some of them didn't. But I think staying home, staying away from people, wearing masks, those things, it's hard to predict what sort of epidemic is going to happen. And with COVID, you just happen to see a lot of similarities with influenza. But I think probably the best thing is hygiene, right? Washing our hands, keeping clean. Those are the things that are. That's the same with typhoid, right? Proper hygienic practices. So these are the things that you see over and over again. And so when we look at past outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics, what have you, you do see these commonalities, and I think those are the things you kind of want to grab onto and think about when there's another, a new outbreak like the one we're going through now.
Good. And we have a question from earlier. Did the spread of typhoid at different parts of the city more or less, depending on whether they were upstream? So you talked a little bit about inequalities. Was position in the city in any particular factor?
Sorry, can you just repeat that? Was it?
Sure. So I'll just read what they said.
Yeah.
Did the spread of typhoid affect different parts of the city more or less, depending on whether they were upstream?
Oh, I don't think so, because I think the problem was that, at least in 1904, 1905, that it was the contaminated water was mixed with the domestic water supply. So in that case, anyone that had indoor plumbing potentially had contaminated water in their pipes. So I don't know if geographic location had too much to do with it, but it's possible.
Fiona says, who developed the polio vaccine? I remember being given it when I was in elementary school.
Yeah, there were two. Salk and Sabin vaccinations. Most people remember them. And it's interesting because with the first one, Winnipeg had the opportunity to be part of a big trial. And so city public health officials were thinking about it, and then they realized it was too late in the school year because you would have to have 3 shots of it to make it effective, to be part of the trial, and the school year was ending, and so they didn't know if they'd be able to kind of corral all these elementary school kids for the second and third phases of the vaccine trial. So Winnipeg didn't join in. But yeah, so that was in the mid-50s. 1953 was the last kind of pre-vaccine epidemic. So in the 50s and 60s, you saw like a rapid decrease in the number of polio cases in Canada.
Okay, we have another comment from Facebook. It would be great if the museum could put the iron lung on display. The Royal Alberta Museum has one, and it's quite a moving thing to see up close. So how would you describe seeing one of these iron lungs? Because yeah, they're quite different from our medical experience today.
Absolutely, I agree with you. I think it should be on display. I've actually never seen the one the museum has. It's it's in storage. And when I was putting this presentation together, the museum's closed. So my lovely boss, curator of history, Roland Sawatsky, went in and took some pictures of it for me. I have seen one at Riverview. So the Riverview Health Center has a little kind of museum, and they have one on display there. And I went there many years ago when I was doing research for my dissertation, and so I was going to go up to the room to look at all the records, and someone said to me, "Hey, do you want to see, you know, our artifacts?" And I said, "Sure." And I walked in, and there's this iron lung in the middle of the room, and it's quite striking, especially because, you know, they're huge, they're big things, and, you know, they're not sleek. They have portals in the side where nurses could put their arms in, and that's how they took care of the patient, so they didn't have to open them. And so you think of it, and when you see pictures of people in them, you think that that's what was keeping people alive. And they were loud. I've never heard one being turned on, but they were very loud machines. They all had bellows kind of pumping. And so if you were in a room with a whole bunch of iron lungs, the sound would be quite unique, I guess. But yeah, it was really quite striking to see, and very sobering, especially because one of the other things I did for my research was I listened to a bunch of interviews that had been done with people who had polio. I didn't do the interviews, but I listened to them. So these are Winnipeggers that had contracted polio, mostly in the 1950s. And there were a couple things that stuck with me. And one of them was a woman who, she was pregnant when she got polio. She got bulbar polio, so she needed to be put in an iron lung, and she had to give birth while she was in the iron lung. So, you know, just looking at them, even the pictures, like you said, are quite striking. And so thinking of people kind of having to live, you know, their lived experiences are going on while they're in these iron lungs that are allowing them to breathe is quite, you know, it's pretty sobering and interesting. And I think seeing them really brings that home for people who don't know about polio, because it's pretty much, I mean, it's almost eradicated. There's still cases of it in some places, but it's not something that we see or kind of have to deal with on an everyday basis, for sure.
Yeah, I can't imagine giving birth in an iron lung. My
Nope.
goodness. No. Okay, another question. Did the Kenny method change the outcome for those who got post-polio syndrome? I don't know if that's something you know.
Yeah, no, I don't know the answer to that question. But it's actually very good. That's a very interesting research question. So post-polio syndrome, I did do a little bit of research into it. So that's basically, and I'll just kind of simplify it for time purposes. But so people who contracted polio, often their symptoms abated, you know, after a year or two, and they could, you know, they carried on with their lives. But as people aged, you know, so in the 1980s, I guess, people started getting those symptoms again. So, you know, all of a sudden they would have muscle weakness or trouble breathing. So similar to the symptoms they had during the polio epidemics. And this is referred to as post-polio syndrome. And a lot of people had trouble getting doctors to treat them, because doctors, once the polio vaccines were implemented in North America, doctors didn't really learn too much about polio anymore. It was just kind of one of those things of the past. And so, you know, the medical establishment was unprepared to deal with post-polio syndrome. But I don't know, I haven't come across anything that says, you know, those people who had the Kenny treatment, I don't know if there's anything that says they had better results or they were less likely to, you know, experience post-polio syndrome. So I'm not too sure of that. But there is more research being done on post-polio syndrome. People are actually paying attention to it, or have been paying attention to it in the last decade or so. So it's possible that some scientists have looked, or researchers have looked into that. Well, that's a really good question.
Okay, we have a rather complicated question here, so I'll just read out the whole thing.
Okay.
The question says, I'm curious about the circulation of information around past pandemics. Today, facts are convoluted and buried in information overload. How do people respond to communicative practice? Is the information age helping us or confusing us? So that's a deep question.
Yeah, and I don't feel qualified to give an answer on what's going on today. Everyone has, certainly you're right that that there is so much information that, you know, a lot of people, we don't know how to process it, right? It's coming at us from so many directions. But I think the thing is, especially with influenza and especially with polio, you did have public health officials making daily statements. So in the newspapers, I'll speak to polio because that's the disease I'm most familiar with. Every day, the front page of the Free Press would talk about how, you know, how many cases had been reported, how many people had died, how many people had recovered, what was going on in kind of the research world to, you know, to kind of try to help with polio. So it was pretty much always front page news. Public health officials, it's not like today where, you know, instantaneously their press conferences are on TV and on Facebook and on Twitter and what have you, but they tried to be as transparent as they could. One interesting thing that I came across with the polio epidemics, even as late as 1953, was that every day when they would report new cases in the newspapers, they would list the address of the person who had contracted polio. So you could, and I mean, that's not something you would do now, right, with privacy legislation, but you could open the paper and there'd be like 10 addresses, and that's where you know people had polio. So there were issues around information then too, but I think at least for Winnipeg, you know, officials tried to be as transparent as possible and to give the information that people needed to know in a timely manner. And I mean, I think that we're seeing that as well today. So, you know, there are definitely some similarities in how information is disseminated about diseases, for sure.
Well, I think that's a great comment there, Leah. Is there any last comments that you would like to make?
No, I don't think so. I just want to thank everyone for listening and letting me speak about things that are really interesting to me. And I hope that everybody was able to kind of get something out of it. And you know, I know a lot of people are kind of scared about COVID, and even though numbers are not high here, but I find it helpful to think about past pandemics and epidemics, and you know, Winnipeggers coming together to help each other and to try to deal with what we're going through. And I think that, you know, that's really all we could do now from our own homes.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we entitled this talk, you know, This Too Shall Pass. So, you know, we're so caught up with this in our 24-hour news cycle, and it's so you know, in the forefront of everybody's minds. I think it's great to take a look back and see how, you know, we have survived these things in the past.
The other thing I wanted to say is the company that makes these little, they're called giant microbes. You can actually pre-order the COVID-19 one. So you know, everybody's right on the ball with the pandemic. So anyway.
Yes, we'll have to get them to be the retroactive sponsor of our talk. And speaking of that, the Manitoba Museum is currently closed, so we do hope to be opening very soon. We are a nonprofit organization, so if you enjoyed today's talk and you would like to hear more talks like this, we would be greatly appreciative of donations. We will be putting a link up on our, well, a link in the Facebook comments if you would like to do so today. And if you can also do that by going to our website. On the front page of our website, you can also sign up for our Manitoba Museum at Home newsletter, where you'll be able to be made aware of future talks. One of the next upcoming talks in our series, sort of in the same vein as this, is June 16th at 2 o'clock, that's Tuesday, where we will be talking about jingle dresses and the jingle dress dance, which is a healing tradition in Indigenous cultures, which has you know, certainly gotten a prominence during the current pandemic. So thank you so much for joining us today, and yeah, check out our future programs, and a recording of this session will be put on our YouTube channel by tomorrow, so you can share or watch it there if you didn't see the whole thing. And for our teachers out there, If this is a topic that you would like us to address with your students, we're open to doing virtual presentations for classes as well. We do have a whole series of virtual field trips that we've been offering to school groups. So the easiest way probably is just to shoot an email to the museum and it will get to us, and we will see what we'll be able to do. So thank you so much again, Leah, for that excellent presentation.
Thank you.